Okay, could we see an NHL lockout in 2026? Potentially, yes, but also potentially no. I don't think a lockout would suit the playing base, so the NHLPA, and I don't think it would suit the owners in the league for a variety of reasons. But the CBA is up, and we have seen in past CBA negotiations the relationship break down. We've seen 3 lockouts and a player strike in my lifetime in the Gary Bettman era. And that is a concern that fans have, is that we've had this Labour peace for a long time. But in the space of a better part of 2 decades, we had 3 lockouts and a player strike. So there was a lot of labour unrest in the 90s and the 2000s into the 2010s. We're now midway through the 2020s. We've had Labour peace for quite some time, for over a decade, nearly 15 years. And fans are concerned because the Gary Bettman expansion era, and we will call it that, the modern era, we have seen this labour unrest in the past, and the relationship between the NHLPA and the league has broken down before. Now, Marty Walsh, who is the head of the NHLPA, he's only recently been appointed to the role in the last 12 months. He's new in the role. He is having meetings with players of all 32 teams. He's canvassing the playing base. Now, an NHLPA boss will do that anyway. We'll have regular meetings with NHLPA members. The fact that this is newsworthy is this will be his first CBA negotiation as NHLPA head. That, I think, is what is making this a newsworthy topic of discussion. So it's interesting that he has publicly stated that he's going around meeting players of all 32 teams. Any other year, that would be a normal NHLPA head's role. It would be to regularly, have meetings with, the player reps and playing rosters, and that would be a normal thing. But it's CBA negotiation time. Now, Utah, the new location, Salt Lake City. With what happened with Arizona, and we have covered that on the channel, it left a bitter taste in both the NHLPA and the NHL's mouths. It was a bad situation made worse by mistakes made by the NHL. And the NHLPA ran out of patience with the Mullet Arena situation. Now, while the Coyotes actually started to play better at the Mullet, and they actually were making money using a collegiate arena, it was not a suitable long-term thing, and the ongoing arena situation uncertainty was a problem. Players, not only with the Coyotes but other teams, were raising concerns with the NHLPA. It happened very, very quickly towards the end of last season. It did unravel very, very quickly, and Utah stepped up very, very quickly. Very similar to Atlanta moving to Winnipeg. Now, what we saw in that instance was within a couple of years, we had a lockout. We had a shortened season. So that, again, fans have that concern. But I think the relationship with the NHLPA and the NHL is a lot better now than what it was in the 90s, 2000s and 2010s. I honestly do believe that. Now, the NHL did make mistakes in Atlanta. The NHL have obviously made mistakes in Arizona. And people will go, Arizona don't have any fans. Atlanta doesn't have any fans. Those locations do. They are big metro areas the NHL wants to establish roots in, and they tried in both. And in Atlanta's case, in 2 separate occasions. Now, we have this talk of future expansion. But what is interesting is in the first player strike and the first lockout back in the 90s, expansion was a thing. The league was expanding quite rapidly. The second lockout, which cost us a whole season 20 years ago, expansion had just reached its 2000s crescendo, and we had just had 30 teams. And there was this labour unrest. And with the backdrop of this labour unrest, the league was constantly expanding, which means the NHLPA had more members. And so the NHLPA had a bit more power. Now, Seattle's only recently joined the league. Vegas has only recently joined the league in real terms, although they've now established themselves. And Seattle seem to have established themselves now, and they've set down roots and built a fan base. Vegas have set down roots, been successful, built a fan base. And Utah is the new location. Now, we can argue whether it's officially an expansion team or a relocation team, because the Arizona franchise is now being mothballed and they were relocated, and you can argue that it is technically an expansion team without an expansion draft. The league wants to build upon this new location, the Salt Lake City metro and the whole state of Utah, the TV market, the corporate money, and build the fan base there, get new fans in, and of course there are existing fans in the state of Utah. Salt Lake City obviously hosted the Winter Olympics in 2002, which brings me on to Olympic participation. We know there's going to be this Four Nations tournament next year, which is sort of like a practice for the Olympics, and Olympic participation was agreed upon in the last CBA, but when they pulled out Beijing it was for political and health reasons, but they were meant to go. And Olympic participation has been a big sticking point for the NHLPA since 2018, when the players were not allowed to go. And that was a big sticking point. They went in 2014, and they'd been going to the Olympics since 1998 as the NHL players being allowed to go to the Olympics. That became a big sticking point. And the players' response to being told we're not allowing the players to go in 2018 was quite public. Some high-profile players, Ovechkin and Erik Karlsson, for example, were very, very public in the media, giving interviews and showing their disappointment and frustration at how the NHL and the IOC handled that, and they were annoyed they weren't going. So Olympic participation, it looks very, very likely that the NHL players are going to Milan Cortina in 2026. It's basically rubber stamped at this point. The Beijing Games 2 years ago, yes, obviously you could argue that the Chinese government's COVID policies and restrictions meant it was basically not feasible for the NHL to release the players at that time, even though they had agreed to go. It was cancelled quite last minute, and again, frustrating players, but the NHLPA realised it was not a workable situation. So, bearing in mind Europe is on a more favourable time zone for the US and Canada, Olympic participation looks highly likely in 2026, especially with this Four Nations tournament that the NHL is organising this coming season. But the other interesting thing is the player contracts. There's a lot of signing bonuses, and players are structuring their contracts with their agents and their teams to protect themselves, it seems. That those bonuses will get paid. The base salaries won't if there's a lockout, but bonuses are lockout exempt. And a lot of players, their contracts are up in 2025 or 2026, that kind of time frame. They have signing bonuses locked in. And they have contracts structured where bonuses fill in the salary cap, basically, and protect them. That is kind of interesting how players have been structuring their contracts with contract extensions recently. Now, escrow's been a big talking point. Now, I'm not an expert on escrow per se. It impacts the lower paid players more than the higher paid players with a percentage of salary given over to escrow. So those lower paid players, of which there's basically the majority of the league, because the average is distorted by the higher paid contracts, those on more like league minimum or those lower paid contracts are adversely impacted more with escrow, very similar to your standard taxes that you have at local level. So in my country, we have things called council tax and VAT. You obviously have sales tax in Canada and the US. You also have property taxes in Canada and the US. And that can adversely impact those on lower pay than higher pay. You actually feel it more in your pocket when you are hit with those extra sort of local taxes and unavoidable stealth taxes like fuel duty and sales tax, which we call VAT here in the UK. So that escrow side of things is a big talking point, because escrow, while they've paid off the COVID debt, could rear its ugly head again where, for whatever reason, the league loses a bit of revenue, there's a down year in revenue, and escrow comes in to coop up some of the losses. That could be a potential issue. I think that there is a chance of a lockout. We've seen with CBA negotiations in the past, the relationship with the NHLPA and the league has broken down, and we've seen within the NHLPA and within team owners the relationship break down, and therefore negotiations are fraught. And a lot of fans are concerned. Under Gary Bettman, we've already had 3 lockouts and a player strike, and that is a concern going into these negotiations. However, I think the relationship is better now than what it was back in the day. The relationship between the NHLPA and the league is a lot better than what it was. There are still differences on a lot of things, but I think we're less likely to see a lockout in 2 years' time than, let's say, 10 years ago or 5 years ago. I think, as I say, the working relationship is a lot better. I think potentially there's some potential red herrings in regards to Marty Walsh, the new NHLPA head, meeting representatives of the playing groups of all 32 teams. I think there's a few red herrings in regards to the player contracts being structured the way they are. I think that's a fail-safe on the players' side of things, just as a backup in case there is a lockout. But I think a lot of the issues that were there in past years, I think, have been resolved to a satisfactory level between the players and the league. The league is very, very keen on expansion. The league is also very, very keen to establish Utah as a stable franchise with stable ownership and a stable arena situation going forward. We know there are plans for a new arena to be built. We know the state government in Utah has signed off on funding for said arena, and we know that the ownership has got long-term plans in Utah. They already own the Utah Jazz, and the state of Utah wants to attract Major League Baseball, the NFL. They've already got Major League Soccer. They want to attract all these major leagues to the state of Utah, to Salt Lake City, and they want to, invest in the city of Salt Lake City as well. So The situation now to 10, 15, 20 years ago, I think, is markedly different, and the relationship is a lot better now than what it was. However, there are still differences. Yeah, escrow is one of them. Olympic participation long term, not just for 2026, but long term, I think they want that enshrined in there. League minimum contracts, I think there's going to be changes to league minimum contracts coming up in the next CBA because the league is making more money and more teams are profitable now than what they were before. League revenues are up. So it's going to be interesting to see what the sticking points are, potential expansion fees or relocation fees. For example, will the players want a share of that money? They don't currently get that. Could that potentially be part of a CBA negotiation? Long-term Olympic participation, the players want to go. The majority of players want to go, if not all the players want to go. That has been a sticking point in the past. That has led to a fractious relationship, and it's an interesting one. The league is in a stronger position now, as is the player base. So we'll see what negotiations look like. Hopefully they get a deal done before the deadline in 2026. Hopefully we don't get any disruption to the 2026-2027 season. So we'll see what happens, but there's the possibility. There is the possibility, and there is that fear from the NHL fan base, of which I am a fan, that we could see more labour unrest that we have seen in the Gary Bettman era. And if there is any, could that be Gary Bettman's job done? Could the NHL go, we need a new commissioner? Could the NHLPA go, Marty Walsh, you're not the right guy to be leading the organisation of the players forward? So we shall see what happens. Anyway, from me for now, thank you very much for watching. Place your thoughts on the potential for an NHL lockout in the comment section below. I know there's other YouTubers who are more hockey focused, more NHL focused, who know a lot more about how the player contracts are structured, escrow, the discussion around Olympic participation. The relationship between the NHL and IOC has been fractious at times, and what we've seen in the past with expansion, player contracts, player likenesses, player rights, what the players get in regards with the revenue sharing from the league, how that's structured. Will the players ask for, hey, we've got expansion coming up, we've just had a relocation, could we potentially get a share of expansion or relocation fees? So there's a lot to think about, but I think both sides, are in a much better relationship with each other than previously. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Place your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll have some more content for you guys very, very soon.